Hello, sorry for being late. All right, so great to have you. So let's get the names down. All right, and so today we're doing the Articles of Confederation and the decision to scrap them and go to our second and present form of government, our federal republic. All right, and so let's see here. As I'm writing down the names, are there any questions? Any questions or comments? All right. So getting into this, let's take a look. Let's read through it. Maybe. Lack of restraint and indulgence and selfish impulses killed what hopes the newly independent American people had in institutionalizing some of the most enlightened, libertarian, and radically different ideas percolating in the mid to late 1700s. From the top down, Americans under their initial Confederate government succumbed to acquisitiveness, factionalism, and their self-serving instincts rather than adhering to civic virtue, putting the country as a whole first. This played into the hands of conservatives who convinced enough American leaders and people that a less democratic, more centralized government wasn't warranted. All right. So getting into this, right? When you look at, Pennsylvania didn't even have a governor, right? You had a couple colonies that fought for having only a popular branch legislator and no upper aristocratic legislator. That's pretty darn democratic because the governor's executive power during the rhetoric of the War for Independence smacked of tyranny, right? Having a governor, having a king of some sort. And so they wanted no part of it. The representation, still no open, broad, universal representation like we expect today. But you have to remember at the time period, right? People oftentimes adhered to a couple different premises. One was the historical, organic premise, is that whatever extent people are going to become more democratized, it has to organically develop. And when you look at history, who had universal citizenship? I mean, virtually no one. You even look under Pericles of Athens, it was for Athenians only, people who had Athenian mothers only. And so, that's much to ask. And so none of them, even though the rhetoric of the Enlightenment was about human rights, by virtue of being a human being, you were entitled to certain inherent rights. They just didn't think it plausible to go that far. When I say they, I say like in the popular sense, people being able to write in the almanacs, the newspapers, write editorials, popular correspondence that we can get our hands on, and then of course the elite. They kept a very plentiful degree of correspondence, personal introspection that they would write down for us to read now. And they just didn't go that far. Even the liberals like Thomas Jefferson. And so, but nevertheless, And then also you had something called a stake in society thesis, whereby the argument is you could only trust people who have something to lose, who have an investment in the government, in the society, those who have wealth, who have property, who pay taxes. They alone can be trusted with the reins of power to participate in government politically. And so that was an expression used by Hamilton. It wasn't his own, but he oftentimes utilized it, stake in society thesis. But with that having been said, the different states democratized themselves to a large degree compared to, well, arguably. I'm thinking of other historians that I've read, and they contend, well, when you look at the colonial charters, and then you look at the new state charters that they created during the Revolutionary War, there weren't that many fundamental differences. So for instance, you could make the argument that England had us under a mixed government already. You look at the 9 of 13 royal colonies, you had a handpicked governor, you had handpicked royal council, but then you had a popularly elected assembly, and they shared powers. Now, however, they want the governors, as in Massachusetts and other areas, they wanted them to be popularly elected. They wanted the upper branches either to be done away with as the higher house, or to be popularly elected as well. And not always, but some of the states did. And so, yes, that's a form of democratization. They also wanted to lower, I'm not sure if any of them did away with property requirements for citizenship. I don't recall that to be the case yet, but they lowered the requirements for citizenship so that moderate level landowners could now participate, vote, run for office, and utilize the right of suffrage, the citizenship right of suffrage. Because you have to remember, coming from Rome, Greece, these other Western civilizations, right? England and US after England, there were a gradation of levels of rights and privileges and powers that were inherent in citizenship. So, for instance, oftentimes the basic lowest level was economic. You have the right to own property and to buy property, rent, inherit, etc. Then at perhaps a higher level than that is you might have the opportunity of equal protection under the laws. And so hence under criminal law, if someone does you wrong, you have the full rights of citizenship to redress that wrong in a court and have the laws protect you in your basic rights. But then it was a whole other level of suffrage to be able to participate in government. And that's just been the historical norm. To what extent the founding fathers wanted to be revolutionary and very, very novel. You have evidence for that in some of their writings for sure. And to what extent that they were kind of complacent and took it as an axiom, an assumption that you don't question, that you don't greatly change historical realities that radically, is a precarious balance that they seem to have carried and embraced at this time. Areas of novelty and areas of just historical continuity. And so there was kind of an idealistic side to the founding fathers where they wanted to, they talked about a new world order, right? And implementing novel changes. But they also spoke of, they also had a pragmatic side, a practical side. And you see that in the sense that, they didn't go for, none of the states went for universal citizenship. In the Articles of Confederation, they did not try to take on, nor will they subsequently in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, will they take on the issue at a national level of slavery, thinking it as a historical reality. It is what it is. and we have to, accommodate the representatives of the southern states, or else they won't play. They won't join the Confederation, and subsequently they won't join the federal republic. And so at any rate, you have that as a backdrop of going on while we're fighting the war for independence and 4 years afterward. You also have age-old things that are going on, like the fighting amongst those on the periphery of the states that are moving into the frontier areas and expecting immediate representation and the same political rights and protections as the people in the urban areas in the East that were more well established. You have that contention going on. You have economic realities of rivalry and resentment, etc., as far as Americans trying to realize what we'll later coin as the American dream, socioeconomic ascension. And oftentimes that was by way of entrepreneurial pursuits, starting a business of some sort, whether it be an artisan, a skilled worker, or more likely statistically to be a cash crop farmer and to grow some type of cash crop and sell it for profit in the market. But then you have to have access to land. And then moving westwardly to land that's not claimed by other English subjects yet, you run into the problem of Native Americans, it being their land first, and they are progressively being pushed westwardly, and they're fighting for every inch. And so you see that particularly in the Ohio Valley, in around the Great Lakes region. You see it in the Piedmont region of Virginia. You see it through many areas, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and other colonies constantly had that drama going on. Then you had promises given to the soldiers, the common soldiers of the Continental Army and of the colonial militias, the state militias now, promises of land, promises of opportunities in the fur trade in the Ohio Valley. You had promises of payment, and you had the states and the Continental Congress going broke, desperately trying to gain more resources to fight this costly, virtually, 6 to 8 year war. So at any rate, you have all that going on during this war for independence. You have resentment toward the Continental Congress and toward the Continental Army and its proclaimed powers to requisition men and requisition tax revenue from the people, from the counties and other local levels of villages and towns. And so, and then you have differences in motivation and ideology and what we're fighting for exactly in this war for independence. So a lot's going on as far as context. But what's stated in number one, right, is there did seem to be, when you look at institutions, the way the new state governments were formed when we left Great Britain during the war, and kind of eradicated our colonial charters and made new ones. With these states, they did become, relative to before, by and large, more democratic. And so then you have the fact that the founding fathers, who were primarily represented in the Continental Congress and leaders and officers of the Continental Army, and self-proclaimed leaders of this rebellion, they were well-read men by and large. Majority of those that were going to meet in Philadelphia to change the Confederation were lawyers. Quite a few of them were college educated and had a fine classical education. And when you look at the percentage of the American population at large, right, that existed at this time, you're talking about 0.1% of the population had a college education. It just wasn't feasible. And so they were not a mini example. These founding fathers, they were not a microcosm of their generation, of their population. They were arguably the cream of the crop, and they saw themselves that way. You see a lot of evidence of elitism amongst the founding fathers. So when you see this confederation, right, some of the founding fathers are going to agree with it philosophically, like mainly the libertarians, right? Remember, government don't tread on me, have a kind of like the Scottish Enlightenment at this time, the idea that man cannot be trusted with too much power, that power needs to be diffused, it needs to be spread out, and to try to be made as harmless as possible, to become decentralized. And that if we are going to err in Aristotle's trilogy of government, of rather having a monarchy, and of course, this is a false dilemma because there are many other forms of government we could have considered, but in either having a monarchy, an aristocracy, remember aristoi means the best in Greek, or oligarchy, ruled by the few. Same, I interchangeably use both of them, aristocracy and oligarchy, or a democracy by the demos, by the people, right? You look at the libertarians, of what they did is they seem to have implied that democracy of those three is the least evil. It's the lesser evil of the three. That there will certainly be problems with democratic government, but that the consequences of those problems, the consequences of having democratic government, will be less, they thought, pernicious, will be less dangerous to society. And what I mean by less dangerous, the ultimate fear, right, that you find in commonality between liberals and conservatives amongst the founding fathers of that generation, the ultimate fear is tyranny, right, is oppression, and of any sort. And so the libertarians, like I said, they, some of them spoke about the sagacity of the common man. Sagacity, right, is like worldly wisdom, street smarts, common sense, that the average person doesn't need a college education, a classical education, to be equipped to rule and to govern, but just needs good common sense and a good sense of a moral compass of right and wrong. And that there was faith that a lot of American common citizens had just that and could be trusted relatively with some power and influence in government. And then, of course, you had elitists who basically said that the masses are asses, and they were more, intellectually elitist, like Aristotle and Plato, whom they had read. The founding fathers had broadly read. And Aristotle and Plato, right, they were very elitist intellectually. You can make the argument by today's egalitarian standards. Aristotle said some people are born to be slaves. And it was primarily, right, if I recall correctly from my studies, it was two branched, but the primary branch was cognitive ability. The other one was moral compass. And so, the average person, he said, was led by his appetite, like an animal. Just, your Freudian id, your flesh, according to the Puritans, right? Just you want what you want, and you just unmindfully go after it without having, utilizing much critical thinking as far as the wisdom of such actions. And so to Aristotle, a lot of people, he said, are born without the proper use and governing over themselves of reason, of logical thinking, that they should absolutely not be trusted with power, with political participation. And then Plato, right? Remember, he talked about having, it's kind of a misnamed according to some people, book, his Republic, wasn't much of a republic in the Aristotelian sense of being a mixture of democracy, aristocracy, and a monarchy. It seemed to lean very, very strongly to the aristocratic side. Of you have your group of leading, educated intellectuals, right, who wear the certain color as a sign of dominance in his ideal society. And so the founding fathers had read all that, right? And so some of the conservatives imbibed that, they took it in and accepted it and thought we should not and do not trust the average uneducated American with power and political participation. Sure, he could have freedom, he could have economic opportunities, and he can have basic political protections and rights, but it should stop there, right? And so, and not to mention, they had read their history. And when you look under, Athens, Athens really, arguably, from like if my memory is correct, like from the 600s to 300s BC, they had a very quick ascension and a high ascension in power and intellectual flowering. When it came to comparison with Sparta and the other city states, the other whatever the plural is for polis, the other city states, right, of the Greek Confederation, they did very well and had a heyday. But it also, you could make the argument, it ended as a fiasco. When you look at class warfare, religious, or not religious, but popular tyranny through the judicial system and through the assemblies, and it didn't last. They had civil strife, and they had tyrants come and go, and so they had read their history, their Greco-Roman history. I mean, same thing with Rome, right? You look at a very democratized times of the Roman Republic, like under the Gracchus brothers, right? And they utilized the power of the tribunes of the lower popularly elected Roman house versus the Senate, and it turned into a class war, and it didn't end well. So the founding fathers had done their historical reading, their classical reading, and they'd had plenty of red lights blink up to them saying, look out, don't have too much democracy. The people will be led by their appetite, by their id. They'll just go after what they want, and it will have harmful repercussions. And so when you look at some of these colonies and you see what happens, it's as if the colonies played right into the hands of all of this conservative rhetoric of their education, of the founding fathers' education, so that the conservatives like John Adams could tell the liberals like Jefferson, see, I told you so. Too much democracy is possible and can be harmful. And so, and then on the other end of the spectrum, in addition to too much democracy, another fear was having too decentralized power. Power can be too decentralized, so that, as you could easily guess, the consequence can be chaos, not having adequate centralized power. And so again, in this realm, I've read my Greco history, but I'm very ill-equipped to speak about the city-states of Italy during the medieval time period and the early modern time period, the Scandinavian city-states and Confederation. But from what I understand of other books generally commenting on those confederations, is that they grew jealous of one another. they fought with one another, and they didn't last. And so, the founding fathers were fixated, I would make the argument, on at least two themes as they read their classical and historical, works. Is one, they wanted to avoid tyranny of any sort, whether it be by one person, a few, right, in the form of an oligarchy, or even the many, tyranny of the majority, as you might arguably find under Pericles in Athens and under the Gracchus brothers of Rome. They also were afraid of longevity. They wanted a government that would last. You find a lot of quotes about that from John Adams. You find a lot of quotes of that from Benjamin Franklin, concern about having a government that could last. And how ironic, right? That I don't know if the right word is ironic, but with their fixation on that second one, the Confederation only lasted 4 years after the war. During the war and for 4 more years until 1787, when we devised our present government, our republic. So looking in hindsight, I guess they had reason to be concerned for the duration of whatever government they established. So looking at number one, you find evidence that that generation had an opportunity for having, relative to being under Great Britain, relative to colonies under other powers and to other countries, period, in the 1700s, they had the opportunity to have a pretty democratic government and a rather decentralized government. And remember, decentralized was seen in libertarian worldview as a way of offsetting tyranny. Keep power localized, keep it small, keep it diffused and spread out, and it's less likely to become consolidated under one individual or one small group. And so those were both seen to be positive things, right? But the argument is on number one is that they took advantage of it and they played right into the hands of the conservatives, so that the conservatives could tell the liberals, the libertarians, I told you so. I told you you should have read your Aristotle and your Plato. You should have read up on Periclean Athens, and you should have known having this democratic of governments was not going to work. Having this decentralized of a confederation was not going to last, right? And the argument is because that generation did not adhere to civic virtue. Civic virtue, I think of like Cicero and Tacitus of Rome, where they talk about putting the country, putting your republic ahead of your own selfish interests of whatever class you're in or whatever demographic you identify with. Instead of just going after what you selfishly, personally want, put what's best for the entire country as your top priority, and that will ensure the health of your country. And they did not do that, according to number one. So things that they did, right? The popularly elected legislators, they wanted access to Native American lands. They wanted access to free and cheap lands. And so they had some costly wars with Native American tribes. Then when crops didn't go the way that they wanted, they didn't really arguably have much of a universally recognized insurance industry yet, crop insurance. And so you lost everything, right? And you had to borrow to be able to begin to cultivate the land to begin with. It takes money to make money, right? And so people trying to chase after that American dream were borrowing money. And then when crops did not go as well as anticipated, they suddenly found themselves indebted. And so what did they do is they tried to appeal using their newfound political participatory power and putting pressure on their elected reps to give them stay laws, to put off their debts and to give them a longer time to pay them back, to engage in inflationary printing of money as a short-term solution to their problem. And so finally, in Massachusetts, after several state laws had been enacted, the elected assemblymen finally said enough is enough. And they said, okay, now under English common law, because we didn't completely discard English common law by any means, becoming independent, they said, now the courts can go after these debtors. And they did. They tried to, at least. And the debtors armed themselves, right, in Shays' Rebellion, and threatened to kill the judges and stated, you won't take an inch of our land. You will not put any of us in jail as debtors, or else, or will threaten violence. And a lot of them put on their colonial, continental, or militia uniforms, symbolically, as if they were fighting against the same old British influence of common law, of the rich over the poor. And so at any rate, when this happened, it eventually escalated, and they actually had a battle and with Shays' Rebellion, and the rest of the country was just gasped in horror with what was going on. It looked as if a poor debtor versus the establishment civil war was about to erupt in Massachusetts. So you had that, and you could look up not too long before this, the regulator movement in the Carolinas, the Paxton Boys, I believe it was Pennsylvania, and you'll find evidence of these common themes, right? But to George Washington and other conservatives, this was way too far. This was the people just acting selfishly, rashly, avariciously, greedily, right? And something needed to be done about it. Too much democracy, and it was manifesting itself in an ugly fashion. Then when it comes to the Confederate part of the Confederation, different states almost went to war. Pennsylvania and Virginia almost went to war over the Ohio Valley. New Jersey and New York had commercial wars against each other, and taxing one another's products. And so you find evidence of jealousy, rivalry, and just strife between the states. And that's exactly what the conservatives had warned would happen and feared, right? And remember, the idea was that with having too decentralized of a confederation, is that England, Spain, who was right next door and controlled the Mississippi River, France, who still had its lock on the Americas in certain areas, might just lick their lips and make another go at colonizing the Americas, so that, not even a decade independent, Americans might become enslaved again. So there were great fears about civil strife and us fighting one another, that we were either going to implode from within, or some big European power was going to again try to gobble us up. And so all this is happening, right? So that when you see the Confederate Congress, you don't see a lot of dramatic changes. At least I haven't yet in my reading, as far as like libertarians totally turning conservative because of these events. But what you do find, like in the person of Thomas Jefferson, is libertarians becoming silent, not fighting as viciously on paper and with a printed word as they had once done and could often do when the conservatives began to take over and say, you know what, this is too much. We need a more centralized government. We need a less democratic government if we want to last and grow and expand. And so, your Patrick Henrys, give me liberty or give me death. Your Thomas Jeffersons in the Declaration of Independence and his vociferous grievance lists against George III. They didn't do that against the founding fathers nearly with the same ardor, the same zeal, the same feeling of urgency, I would make the argument, as they had done against Great Britain. And the argument is is that perhaps deep down they knew themselves. They had at least partially psychologically capitulated to the conservatives and thinking, you know what, I hate to admit it, but maybe there is some semblance of truth to what the conservatives are saying and to what we had read in Aristotle and Plato and what we had read about the historical attempts of having democratic government, about the historical attempts of having decentralized confederacies. Because remember, under a confederation, each state is almost autonomous. It's almost independent with just very few exceptions. So under the confederation that we had, right, it took 9 of the 13 states to pass a law. It took all 13 states to make an amendment, which was virtually impossible. They deliberately wanted it that way, so nothing radical could be implemented, right? If your reps from your state said no to a tax, then they had no coercive power over your state to collect that tax. Your state said no, so those taxes weren't collected in your state. And as you know, that's not the case anymore, right? Our 2 senators in California, our House of Reps, representative of our 50,000 person district, whoever it might be, sadly, I'm unaware presently. If those representatives say no, but a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate say yes to a tax, then it's being collected here in this district just the same. That wasn't the case under the Confederation. Very deliberately kind of toothless. There was no executive. There was just a legislator. No president of this confederation. Some might make the argument that the person chosen as the speaker over the legislator and over the committees was somewhat like a president, but not really. I think that's kind of a weak argument. And so this was made deliberately as kind of a toothless tiger, this confederation, again, because we were so worried during the War for Independence and the 4 years thereafter about having a centralized, powerful cadre of individuals or one individual usurping power at the expense of everyone else. We were so terrified of tyranny coming from a centralized avenue. But now, right, John Adams and others said, see, I told you, you could have tyranny of the majority. Look at this Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. This is anarchy. Something needs to be done. So to me, I get a little bored with this thesis because oftentimes in many topics, historiographically, the discourse changes. A new thesis comes up that's thought-provoking and challenges the previous popular thesis. And this one has just survived since the 90s, at least, when I was a student. This common thesis. Pardon me. So at any rate, that's the thesis, right? Is that we tried a very libertarian, decentralized, democratic government known as the Articles of Confederation for an 8-year war and 4 years thereafter. And this government only lasted those 12 years because that generation abused its liberties. That generation, in the pursuit of its own selfish interest, fought with one another and created discord, was financially irresponsible, and hence created such a mess that it convinced even the liberal libertarians, leaders, right, and people, that perhaps this was too much, and that the conservative founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams had legitimacy in their argument and saying that we need an actually more centralized, more centrally empowered republic and less democratic republic to be established. All right. So any questions on number 1? the rash and selfish behavior of the revolutionary generation spoiled its attempt, its experiment with democratic and decentralized government, so that it played into the hands of the conservatives who could say, I told you so. I told you you could make a government that is too democratic, that is too weak and decentralized. Okay? All right. Could I get a thumbs up? Are you guys still with me? Hopefully you haven't fallen asleep. Everyone can hear me okay? Thank you.
We're with you. We're with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. And then thank you, Aaron and Amain. Let's see here. Popular clamor for enlightened and classically liberal government extracted concessions from the founding fathers. So in this one, right, is, you know, it goes a little bit in the opposite direction. You can make the argument with number two from number one. Is number one, right, the people capitulated to the founding fathers and said, fine, you can make a less democratic, more centralized government. And of course, in hindsight, we know they did, right? As we'll get to on our next assignment, the Constitution is pretty conservative overall, as I think that you'll probably agree with me on that assessment as you do the next week's assignment. But at any rate, when they put that Constitution together, right, the founding fathers who appointed themselves, basically, I mean, they had already been elected in their respective states into the Confederate Congress, but then they elected themselves into these closed sessions to write a new government in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, right? And you look at pictures of the Constitutional Convention, and again, it is not, symbolic and emblematic of the population at large. These are well-educated, well-to-do men who carry themselves with an air about them, with quite, a sense of elitism. You can make the argument of being the cream of the crop. So they insisted that the press could not enter. So Madison and a couple others wrote notes from which we glean to this day, but the press was not welcome. The people, their constituents, were not welcome. And they put together this new Constitution. When you look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it says now the federal Congress has power to, and it gives a lot of powers that were rendered to the states during the Confederation. So I would subjectively make the argument that Article 1, Section 8 alone shows that this is a much more centralized government than a confederacy. All right. Then you look at the fact that you have the House reps, right? You have senators and a bicameral legislator known as Congress, right? Then you also have the executive, the president and vice president. Then you have the executive's cabinet, which I arguably would say is a fourth entity. And then you have Supreme Court, right? Discussed in the first three articles. So of those five, how many are to be elected by citizens? One. Only one, the House reps. 1 out of 5 major federal offices is elected by citizens. And it says in districts of no less than 50,000 people. So one elected voice for 50,000, not even people, but 50,000 civilians, citizens, right? That's not that democratic. That's not that democratic at all. And so at any rate, it's something to think about. And so you have all this going on. They write it. Then they wanted to go back in several states. And by the way, I would highly recommend this book, Ratification by Pauline Meyer. And you could read all of it in this book. They go back to their respective states. And I kid you not, several of the 13 states tried to have a closed session on ratifying the Constitution, right? Away from the public, away from the press, away from their constituents who had formally elected them into office, right? And so that they could approve or ratify it themselves. And I jokingly employ, right, the modern metaphor. That's like correcting your own paper. That's like, correcting and grading your own work. Of course, you're gonna say it's great and everything's hunky dory. Where's the sense of consent of the governed, right? That was so rampant in our rhetoric during the War for Independence, right? Remember the idea of the social contract is the people give their permission, their consent to those who rule, right? To serve not as their rulers, but as their servants, as their elected servants, right? To protect their natural rights. And now you have this elitist group who wants to ratify its own work, its own privately, secretly devised work. And this work, as we know, is less democratic and more centralized than the government that they were scrapping. So that's pretty elitist, right? So her book does not make the founding fathers, it does not portray them in a positive light. It depicts them as being rather elitist with their own selfish, class-based agenda. Nevertheless, what happens, especially in the New England states, is people become incensed by this, right? Adamant and saying, oh, heck no, we are not going to give our okay to this Constitution without certain stipulations, without certain conditions or caveats, right? So what did people do? Is in many towns and cities, they elected their own reps, and their reps came with a list of demands uninvited to the ratification conventions of their own states. Said, excuse me, I'm here representing Modesto, California, and here's what Modesto people contend that we demand. There's nothing in this Constitution that we're aware of that guarantees any individual rights to its citizens. And we're not okay with that. So by and large, right, and a lot of them had particular grievances, right? We have the grievance that we want to ensure that certain rights for suspects. We want to ensure the freedom of the press. We want to ensure freedom of expression. We want to make sure the right to bear arms is present. So the founding fathers, according to her book, grudgingly conceded to a Bill of Rights because the people demanded it when they were trying to get it ratified. So they initially weren't going to put the Bill of Rights in there, but public demand coerced them, pressured them into grudgingly doing it. And the idea was they had the ghost of the mutinies during the war, of Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, lingering in their minds, saying, if we don't at least give something to the people, they're likely going to rebel. And we don't want that. So let's make a compromise with them. If they will help us institute this more elitist, this more centralized, this less democratic republic, then the least we can do is give them and grant them certain enlightened components to it. So it makes that generation of common Americans look nothing less than heroic. Her book does, demanding these things. But it makes the founding fathers look quasi awful and having their own agenda and having almost to be coerced, pressured into conceding the enlightened components to our republic. So any questions on number 2? Any questions or comments? All right. And so I believe I'll be happy to post the test questions for this. But if my memory serves me correctly, they literally constitute 2 questions, 1 question on each of these sections thesis on test 2. So from this handout, sometimes a handout will have, as you'll see, 8 to 10 questions that I put on the test. This one only has 2. And it's on each of these theses, each of these arguments. So remembering both of them, you should be able to get both questions right when you take test 2, when that time comes. All right. Well, I hope you guys are doing well. I'm going semi-mad under these COVID circumstances. My job is much easier doing things online, but I'm going a bit mad not being able to go to school and see people in person and so forth. So I wish I could see you in person. I hope you're doing well. You have again until Sunday night at midnight to submit this. So don't give up the fight. We're getting underway. I think we're at least a quarter, if not approaching a third way through already the semester. But if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the day and for the week, okay?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Savan. I appreciate that. I really do. So you guys have a great week, okay? Take care. I wish you well. Be safe. And good luck on this. I'm sure you're going to do well on this assignment. And I'll see you next week. And thank you for coming in good numbers. I'm happy to give all these names extra credit.